For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hi, welcome to another podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet. I'll be your host as usual. Today we're going to be talking about Revelation 4, verse 6, and you can find the nutshell version of this in my book at section 43. By way of background and introduction, you'll recall that here in chapter 4 we're looking with John into a door into heaven, where he saw the paradise of God and the throne of God there in the postmortal spirit world. And so if you go back and take a look at my podcast on April 21st of 2024, it gives you an overview of chapter 4. It might be helpful to take a look at that as you begin to do this podcast today. It's kind of like that podcast is Paradise 101, and this is kind of an upper level course in the postmortal spirit world. So at any rate, we're going to be covering today Revelation 4:6, but we're going to be cutting the verse into two pieces. It's because there's too much information to cover in a single verse in a single podcast, if you can believe it. So at any rate, we start out in Revelation 4:6, which says, quote, "And before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto crystal, and in the midst of the throne and round about the throne there were four beasts full of eyes before and behind." So today what we're going to be focused on is this throne located where we see the sea of glass like unto crystal. And the rest of it we're going to pick up next week. We're talking about the four beasts and so on and so forth. And so that'll be as far as we can kind of get today. So first of all, let's talk about what the meaning is when it says, "And before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto crystal," starting with the word crystal itself, which anciently kind of mean anything that was kind of congealed and a pellucid or a translucently clear substance that was hard, such as ice. So the Greek word karash for crystal also means ice, and so anciently rock crystal was actually thought to be ice that was intensely congealed over a long period of time. But essentially a crystal is any species of stone that is distinguished for its clearness, and so this would be transparent crystals of quartz and things like that. So in mineralogy, you have this being any inorganic body that has taken the form of a regular solid. It has plain, smooth faces, facets, things like that. Diamond would be a good illustration of that. And so this goes all the way back, the imagery to Ezekiel chapter 1, and including verse 22, which says, quote, "And the likeness of the firmament above the heads of the living creature was as the color of the terrible crystal stretched forth over their heads above," close quote. And so anciently, what this verse is talking about is the belief that there was this firmament that existed between the skies that were visible to the ancient Israelites and the Jews, and then the heaven above that. And so that's why we talked a little bit before about this door needing to be opened to get you through that solid firmament so that John could see into heaven and see paradise in the postmortal spirit world. But in this verse, you'll notice that it's talking about this firmament being the color of a terrible crystal. And so the concept of terrible in that verse is something that's very splendid, very dazzling, and it kind of describes the brightness of heaven. And that's what you kind of have to think about when you're talking about John here in Revelation 4:6, where it describes this sea of glass like unto crystal, meaning it was very bright, it was dazzling, it was splendid in its appearance. And so as we come now to a further discussion of what the sea of glass means in this same verse. This is an allusion to the molten sea or the brass basin in Solomon's temple. And the word sea, S-E-A, comes from the Hebrew word yam. It reminds me of my daughter. She had twins, and she always calls them the yams. I don't know where it comes from, just these silly nicknames that we have in our family, but they're the yams. So at any rate, this Hebrew word essentially refers to both freshwater oceans and in things that convey the idea of the source of all life and fertility according to tradition. And so this is also the basin of holy water in the temple. And this molten sea stood on the backs of 12 oxen in the Temple of Solomon, and it was very, very big. And so there's really no specific or direct connection between the sea of glass that is being seen in heaven, except for the idea that baptisms were performed in the molten sea. And Bruce R. McConkie had this to say about that, saying, quote, "We know that Mosaic temples were used for the offering of sacrifices and various related performances of the law of carnal commandments. It is clear that the molten sea was for baptisms and that the laver was for ritualistic washings," close quote. Now, when we're talking about the laver, we're talking about the same thing as the molten sea. It's just that the laver that existed in the tabernacle anciently was relatively small, and the priests would come and go through their ritualistic cleansing processes with this fairly small, let's say call it a sink size object that held water for them to do so. But then when the Temple of Solomon was built, it turned into this massive, what they call the molten sea, which is basically a huge baptismal font. But it was still used in the same way that a laver was used for ritualistic cleansing as well as baptisms. Now keep in mind that the baptisms that were occurring in the molten sea at the Temple of Solomon were for the living only. They did not have vicarious ordinances for the dead anciently and prior to the time of the death and resurrection and atonement of Jesus Christ. So only for the living. Vicarious ordinances only began after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So what's the connection then between the molten sea and this sea of glass like unto crystal? Well, we're looking in John's vision with him into paradise, which the only people that qualify to go into paradise are those that have lived celestial law, including compliance with the celestial ordinances of baptism and confirmation. And so that's kind of your indirect connection between the molten sea and the sea of glass that John is seeing in the celestial kingdom. So essentially any person who is accountable and of at least the age of 8 years has to have baptism in order to enter celestial paradise. And ultimately, of course, that would be required to enter the celestial kingdom ultimately as well. Now, the crystal and glass have long been associated with glory and fire. And we saw that when I read to you Ezekiel chapter 1, and if you go on, you'll see the connections even more significantly. But you have to keep in mind that crystal and glass are not the same thing, and they're two symbols that are closely connected but have differing meanings. So glass is a manufactured product, while crystal grows in nature. So glass originally was made at least as early as the times of ancient Egypt, 3,800 years ago. And so in some of the ancient monuments, the Egyptian hieroglyphs will show glass bottles and their use in later times. And glass blowing is also represented in the paintings in some of the tombs. The Egyptians also had the ability to color glass, and they had developed the means to actually infuse gold between layers of glass. And so they were pretty good glass workers. And some of the ruins will show glass furnaces that still exist in Egypt today. And so one other just interesting note is the city of Pompeii that was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius, the eruption of that volcano in 79 AD. It covered the city basically with probably about 20 feet of volcanic ash, but they have discovered in the city of Pompeii a glass window. And so glass is of very ancient origin, but of course it is man-made and manufactured. And so when we're talking here about the sea of glass being like a crystal, it obviously connects the two together, but the sea of glass suggests a produced state of purity. In other words, it's man-made, but it's something you'd have to do on your own. If you want to be like a glass in heaven, that's something that you have to work for. You've got to put some effort into that. And on the other hand, crystal being native to nature and to the design and creations of God, that also ties into the celestial paradise, where God's holy nature is present, and he does a lot to contribute to the purity and the cleanliness and the sacredness and sanctity of celestial paradise. And so it's a joint measure. And so we get there by our works, but ultimately through the grace of God is that place the kind of condition that we're describing as we talk about purity and all the words that I've just used to describe it. And so both conditions are present in paradise of the just. And so we refer to it as the paradise of the just because it consists of the disembodied spirits of people who have been justified in this life, having lived their lives worthy, having received the ordinances of salvation, and therefore they qualify for entry into the place of this vision that John is looking at. So we're fortunate in having the Doctrine and Covenants, particularly section 77, which is Joseph Smith's kind of Q&A session with the Lord, asking him about what all these images mean in the book of Revelation. And in verse 1, the very first Q&A that is asked, Joseph was asking about this sea of glass like unto crystal and what it's interpreted as. And so we find in that verse where it says, quote, "What is the sea of glass spoken of by John, 4th chapter and 6th verse of the Revelation? The answer is, it is the earth in its sanctified, immortal, and eternal state." Close quote. Now, this is what tends to give a lot of Latter-day Saints a view of what John's vision consists of that is not consistent with what he's actually looking at. Because if you look at this verse where it says it is the earth in its sanctified, immortal, and eternal state, people immediately jump to the conclusion, well, this is the celestial kingdom, because that's sanctified, it's immortal, and it's eternal. And I understand that, and I'm going to, in this podcast today, kind of give you a different version or vision of what John is really saying, because my interpretation of Revelation 4:6, including what Joseph Smith is describing here in 77:1, is it is celestial paradise before the resurrection of the earth. Now keep in mind, this verse does not say, and I'm speaking still of 77:1, it does not say it is the earth in its resurrected, sanctified, immortal, and eternal state. And so if you want to insert a word into this, you could say it is the earth in its unresurrected, sanctified, immortal, and eternal state. You'll notice that I haven't changed the meaning of what Joseph Smith with regard to sanctified, immortal, and eternal state. It's just a matter of timing with when we say, is it the earth in its resurrected form, or is it the earth in its unresurrected form? Because the earth in its unresurrected form in paradise is still a sanctified, immortal, and eternal condition or eternal state. But a lot of people, I would say the vast majority, you want me to put some, I'd say 99% are going to tell you that this is the earth in its resurrected, celestial kingdom state. And I'm telling you, no, John's vision is of paradise. And so I'm going to go through several reasons as to why I think that's true. You can ultimately decide for yourself if I'm just totally whacked out and need to be turned off. But I think that you'll find all of the reasons exist. And I've been kind of doing this as we go along a little bit, giving tidbits of information that talk about why Revelation 4:6 is the celestial paradise. But again, if you compare it to Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, verse 9, it says, "This earth in its sanctified and immortal state will be made like unto crystal, and will be a Urim and Thummim to the inhabitants who dwell thereon." Close quote. So you put that verse together with D&C 77:1, and boom, it looks like we're talking about the celestial kingdom. Now, to be clear, Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, verse 9, is a description of the celestial kingdom, and they sound so similar that this is the reason why everybody seems to kind of jump on board, saying that Doctrine and Covenants 4:6 is a description of the resurrected earth. And so that's what we're dealing with. Consider also what Brigham Young had to say when he said, quote, "This celestial earth will not then be an opaque body as it now is, but it will be like the stars of the firmament, full of light and glory, and it will be a body of light." John compared it in its celestialized state to a sea of glass, close quote. So this is an illustration where Brigham Young is describing the celestial earth, that is, as the celestial kingdom, and saying John compared it in its celestialized state to a sea of glass. So that is an example of what I'm talking about. Let me give you another example here of what Bruce R. McConkie had to say when he was describing the post-resurrection earth that's found in Revelation 21. And he said, quote, "I saw no temple therein," John said, "for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it, and the city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon to shine in it. For the glory of God did lighten it, and the Lamb is the light thereof. This is the day when the earth, as a sea of glass, exists in its sanctified, immortal, and eternal state." And you'll see there that he's quoting Revelation 21, verses 10 through 27, close quote. Now, he's obviously using these words of being sanctified, immortal, and eternal state, which he's kind of taken from Revelation 4:6, but he's put it in the context of Revelation chapter 21. Now, as I've said all along, the book of Revelation is chronological, and Revelation 21 is in fact the time period, chronologically and sequentially speaking, in which John is describing the post-resurrection earth as the celestial kingdom. But yet we have Bruce R. McConkie equating it back, like 18, 19 chapters, not 18, 19, my math is off a little bit. But you go back to the 17 chapters to the postmortal spirit world here in Revelation chapter 4, and they don't equate. They do in the sense that they are mirror images of each other, but they're very distinct type of visions, and the time frame in which they're being looked at is thousands of years in difference, because John's vision in Revelation 4 of the postmortal spirit world is back in 96 AD and shortly thereafter, whereas John's vision in chapter 21 is after the millennium, after the earth dies and after it is resurrected. So thousands of years in difference. But I would simply tell you that most LDS scholars, leaders of the church, interpret Revelation 4:6 as the celestialized earth after the death and resurrection. I'll give you some quick illustrations of who I'm up against here. For example, Joseph Fielding McConkie takes that view in his book called The Revelations of the Restoration, Hoyt Brewster takes that position in his Doctrine and Covenants Encyclopedia. Richard Cowan, in his book entitled Answers to Your Questions About the Doctrine and Covenants. Richard Draper in his book called The Opening of the Seven Seals. So you can see, I'm kind of like, I'm in a boat paddling upstream on this one, but I hope to give you some understanding as to why I come to this conclusion. Then recognizing, of course, that if the sea of glass from Revelation 4:6 does represent the resurrected earth after its death and its celestialization, then in fact we would be talking about Revelation 21, which describes the new heaven and the new earth as being all the same thing. And it means that what some people say about John being all over the map in terms of his visions would be true. That his Revelation 4, then he jumps up into Revelation 21, we're back where we were again, and he's all over the map. But even if you look at Revelation 21, verse 1, where John is describing the new heaven and the new earth as a celestialized condition. Let me just read that verse and show you that verse so that you can see what I'm talking about. In that verse it says, quote, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea." Close quote. Now, do you kind of get it? In this verse where we're talking about the celestial kingdom, John says in my vision, now I don't see a sea. There is no more sea, as in S-E-A, right? And yet in verse 4:6, he's telling us specifically that his vision of paradise is like a sea of glass, like unto crystal. And so the two visions are actually diametrically opposed to one another, in which the first vision of paradise, we have a sea of glass like unto crystal, whereas the celestial kingdom, or the celestialized earth, he's saying, no, there's no more sea. So, and yet people are going to equate these things as though they're the same thing. Now we find something similar in Doctrine and Covenants, section 29, verses 23 through 25, that says, quote, "The end shall come, and the heaven and the earth shall be consumed and pass away, and there shall be a new heaven and a new earth, for all old things shall pass away, and all things shall become new, even the heaven and the earth." And so D&C 29 equates to what John saw in Revelation 21, which is the celestialized earth. That is the new heaven. But then if you go back and look at those, Bruce R. McConkie explains that this concept of a new heaven and a new earth actually can mean more than one thing. And so his quote is this: "This expression, new heaven and new earth, is used in two distinct senses in the scriptures. First, it has reference to the millennial, paradisiacal, or renewed earth and heavens that will prevail after the second coming of Jesus Christ." And he gives you various quotes and scriptures where that occurs. And then the second is, in other instances, it has reference to the celestial heaven and earth that will prevail in the day when the Father and the Son make this planet their habitation. And again, he gives various quotations for that, including Revelation 21 that you'll notice in this quote. So close that quote. And so the point I'm trying to make is, we're talking here about this concept of how the earth is going to exist in a sanctified, immortal, and eternal state, in the same way that we talk about the earth being a new heaven and a new earth. But Bruce R. McConkie correctly told you just now that new heaven and earth means more than one thing, depending upon the context. And that's why you've got to be careful in looking at these things, because are we talking about the earth in its sanctified, immortal, and eternal state in the context of the postmortal spirit world? Or are we talking about the earth in its sanctified, immortal, and eternal state in the context of its post-resurrection condition in the celestial kingdom? Because they both apply, but you have to look at the context, as shown by Bruce R. McConkie talking about the meaning of new heaven and new earth. It depends upon the context. And so I say, good job to Elder McConkie. I mean, I've been telling all these people that got it wrong, and you're probably sitting here thinking I'm a whack job. But good job to Elder McConkie, who has it exactly right when he's talking about new heaven and new earth. It can have more than one meaning depending on the context. When I think about good job, I always think about the the movie with Will Smith called Hancock, right? And Hancock's this superhero, immortal person that is also a drunk. His life is totally out of control. And so he gets connected up with this guy that's going to try and change his image and get him to be the kind of superhero that he's supposed to be. And he's trying to convince Hancock that when the police officers are doing their work, and of course Hancock said, "Well, the police never do their work. They're horrible." He said, "No, no, no, no. You got to tell them. You got to, give some positive reinforcement. When they do good, you tell them good job." And he says, "I'm not telling them good job." And so he's trying to teach Hancock how to say good job. Good job. Good. So that's what I think about anyway. But good job to Bruce R. McConkie, like he needs me to tell him he's doing a good job, right? Okay, but at any rate. So what we see essentially is this concept that the new heaven and new earth are not synonymous with celestial paradise, because it can have these multiple meanings, just as the celestial paradise in Revelation 4:6 is not necessarily synonymous with the sanctified, immortal, and eternal state of the earth after its resurrection in the celestial kingdom. Now notice the wording that we're looking at here in Revelation 4:6, and I'm going to have it here at the bottom of the screen. It says, "The sea of glass like unto crystal." Okay, and so here you have this concept of the earth being like unto, and so it's the same sense that is in Doctrine and Covenants section 77:1, where it says the earth is described in a sanctified, immortal, and eternal state. It's essentially saying it's like unto the earth in its sanctified, immortal, and eternal state. Now, the words "like unto" don't appear in Doctrine and Covenants section 77:1, but you put the two together, then that's essentially what we're talking about. So these words can describe the earth post-resurrection in a sanctified and immortal state, but that's what they are like unto in the context of the celestial paradise. And the one mirrors the same. And so it's entirely appropriate to use the same words, because one can have the meaning of the other, just as a new heaven and a new earth can have two different meanings using exactly the same words, because one is like unto the other. And as long as you understand the context, there's no confusion about them in either case. And so it's important to say the earth is not an actual sea of glass. That's not what Revelation 4:6 is saying. It's not an actual sea of glass, nor is it an actual crystal. These are simply figures of speech that typify the glorified condition of the celestial paradise, but those same words would typify the glorified condition of the earth after its resurrection. And so we see this, something like this again in Doctrine and Covenants section 130, verses 7 and 8, which says, quote, "But angels reside in the presence of God on a globe like a sea of glass and fire, where all things for their glory are manifest, past, present, and future, and are continually before the Lord. The place where God resides is a great Urim and Thummim," close quote. Now, the context of that verse obviously tells you that we're talking about a post-resurrection celestial kingdom type of place of residence for God the Father, which is a Urim and Thummim. Okay, well, the interesting thing about that is, of course, that if the celestial kingdom is this, this glorious place where all things are manifest through means of a Urim and Thummim, what does that tell you about the celestial paradise? We can learn from that, because the two are essentially mirror images of each other, which is what I've been saying, and that tells you a little bit about the fact of what the disembodied spirits that exist in the postmortal spirit world have the ability to see, just as post-resurrection people have the ability to see things that are manifest past, present, and future because of the Urim and Thummim-like conditions that exist in the celestial kingdom would then, because there are mirror images, apply to the postmortal spirit world. Shazam. Now we get an idea of what it must be like to be in the postmortal spirit world. But in both cases, what is being described here is this brilliance that exists because of this great concentration of light and truth. And so these objects are used to describe what is being seen in both places. Now, Hiram Andrus, who was a prolific LDS writer, he probably wrote 20 plus books. He said this on the subjects that we're talking about here. He said, quote, "The sphere upon which angels dwell is like unto glass or crystal, in that it is purified by the divine intelligence that is organized within it. As the prophet would say, all corruption is devoured by the fire. A glorified sphere is also likened unto crystal, because by the powers of glory or intelligence centered in it as a celestial sphere, one can view the inner elements as you can a crystal, rather than being limited in view to that which is on the surface." Close quote. So again, it's all about this like unto language of what the glass and the crystal represent, as I've kind of been speaking about. And it's going to be the same whether we're in the celestial kingdom or whether we're in celestial paradise. But I find it fascinating. We often talk about how this life, this mortal life, parallels the conditions that existed in our premortal life. And we can learn because things are typological, because there are similitudes, because there are foreshadows. One tends to teach us about the other, and vice versa. And so also is it with the postmortal spirit world and the celestial kingdom. If you understand something about one, it tends to instruct you and teach you about conditions in the other. And so I think it's an important concept that we understand. So this is the kind of my first reasoning as to why Revelation 4:6 is a description of the postmortal spirit world, is because of these likenesses, and we don't need to confuse ourselves about one versus the other. Now, the second reason that I have for saying that Revelation 4:6 describes the celestial paradise is because, as I've said before, John's visions proceed chronologically. And I go through a complete discussion of this in my podcast from Come Follow Me lesson number 4 on October 22nd of 2023, where you can go back and listen to that. And I'll talk about the structure of the book of Revelation. So I highly recommend that. I mean, it was an excellent podcast, if I do say so myself. But at any rate, if we assume that Revelation 4 is in fact talking about the celestial kingdom, as I've mentioned, then we're completely out of order. And it just completely destroys the sequencing in the book of Revelation. Okay, so the third reason why I believe that Revelation 4:6 describes celestial paradise is because the proximity of objects that are located in the vision that John is having here in Revelation 4:6. Now, it's important to note in this verse that God's throne is not placed in the midst of the sea of glass. And so we are told in this verse that essentially the throne was before the sea of glass, not in the midst of the sea of glass, which means that the throne and the sea of glass are separated one from another. Now, this shows that this must be the condition of celestial paradise, which would be separated from the fullness of God's presence or the fullness of his throne. So while we have a throne sitting in celestial paradise and God the Father's presence is on that throne, yet there is this separation in the description of what is being talked about. And someone who would understand this very well is Joseph F. Smith, who had the vision of the redemption of the dead in the 138th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. And he said this, quote, "The disembodied spirit during the interval of the death of the body and its resurrection from the grave is not perfect. Hence, it is not prepared to enter into the exaltation of the celestial kingdom, but it has the privilege of soaring in the midst of immortal beings and of enjoying, to a certain extent, the presence of God, not the fullness of his glory, not the fullness of the reward which we are seeking and which we are destined to receive if found faithful to the law of the celestial kingdom, but only in part, close quote. So there is his description of someone who actually saw the postmortal spirit world and recognized that the fullness of the Father was not present in the postmortal spirit world, and that's exactly consistent with John's separation of this sea of glass that stands before the throne of God. So you have this separation. Now, once the earth is resurrected and celestialized and becomes a sea of glass, figuratively speaking, then guess what? God's throne in the fullness of his presence will then be in the midst of that sea of glass, not standing separate from it or before it, as indicated in Revelation 4:6. So that's my third reason. Let's go on to my fourth reason for taking the position that Revelation 4:6 describes celestial paradise. And we're going to go back to Revelation 4:2, which says, quote, "And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne," close quote. Now, you can go back and listen to my podcast on that particular verse. And what it talks about in essence is that God the Father is sitting alone on the throne. Okay, it says one sat on the throne. It's almost like John is in your face throwing this at you. Pay attention. I'm talking about only one person is sitting on the throne. And by implication, and it's not implication only, but by clear statements, God the Father is sitting on the throne. But if you then look at the earth in its celestialized condition in Revelation 21, guess who's sitting on the throne? It's not just the Father, it's Christ, and all his exalted saints are sitting with the Father on the same throne. And this promise is made to saints who overcome in Revelation 3:21. This was to our friends, the lukewarm Laodiceans, where it said, quote, "To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne," close quote. So you see, this throne is going to be a very busy place, and it needs to be a very large throne because it includes the Father, it includes the Son, and it includes all exaltation-worthy saints who overcome life's travails and trials and qualify themselves for exaltation. Now, this imagery doesn't exist. This sharing of the throne imagery does not exist in John's vision of celestial paradise in Revelation 4, where we learn that there was only one that sat on the throne. And why is that? Why would we only have one person on the throne in Revelation 4:6? And it's because the vision is not depicting conditions after the end of the earth, after the resurrection of the earth, when all exalted saints share the throne of the Father. Okay, so that's number 4. Moving on to reason number 5, why Revelation 4:6 must describe the celestial paradise. Now keep in mind that celestial paradise is just one part of the postmortal spirit world within this earth. And this is made clear by several people, including Elder Orson F. Whitney, who said, quote, "For the earth itself has a spirit, just as we have a spirit within us, and that is the spirit world. And the world upon which we stand is the temporal world," close quote. So he's making the point that the earth has a spirit just as we have a spirit within us. That's an important concept because when we get down to the resurrection of the earth, the same spirit world that now exists within this world will die. They will be separated, or I tend to think they might be resurrected in the twinkling of an eye. So we're not going to get this huge separation of the spirit of the earth and the resurrected earth. And the same thing happens with some people in certain circumstances. They're changed in the twinkling of an eye. So their resurrection and death are basically in the same moment of time. I tend to think that could happen with the earth. But the point is, that's for another day's discussion. But the point is that you have a spirit world within this earth, and when it dies, if we have the complete separation of the two, they will eventually be joined back together again as part of the earth's resurrection. Not one element will be annihilated, and they will exist together, and they will remain inseparable after that, and the earth will be glorified and sanctified and immortal and all of those. But it's the same spirit world, okay? And the spirit world that exists in this world today, in this earth today, is the postmortal spirit paradise that we're talking about. Now, there's two parts of it, as I mentioned, but that paradisiacal part of the spirit world, postmortally speaking, is the world that is glorified and sanctified with not the fullness of the presence of the Father, but the presence of the Father. All right. So, Elder Ezra Taft Benson also said this, quote, "It is difficult for us to realize that the spirit world is close by, that it is all part of the operation here on this earth. President Brigham Young asked the question, where is this spirit world? He answers his own question in these words, it is right here. Do spirits go beyond the boundaries of the organized earth? No, they do not. They are brought forth upon this earth for the express purpose of inhabiting it through all eternity," close quote. So when we talked, remember how the 77:1 talks about the earth in its sanctified, immortal, and eternal state? Well, here we have a statement by President Benson saying that's what this earth is like, including the spirit world. It expresses this idea that we inhabit it through eternity. We inhabited it before this earth was formed physically. It was part of the premortal spirit world. It is part of the spirit world that exists within this mortal earth, and it will continue to be the eternal, immortal, and sanctified spirit world in this resurrected earth through all eternity. Okay, so they're all one and the so we're all describing the same kinds of things. Now, Parley P. Pratt also said this, quote, "As to its location, meaning of the spirit world, it is here on the very planet where we were born, or in other words, the earth and other planets of a like sphere have their inward or spiritual spheres as well as their outward or temporal. The one is peopled by temporal tabernacles and the other by spirits. A veil is drawn between the one sphere and the other, whereby all the objects in the spiritual sphere are rendered invisible to those in the temporal," close quote. Okay, so here we have the description again by these persons who all talk about the existence of this spirit world within the earth. And so it's not difficult to kind of appreciate or understand that if we're talking about the conditions of paradise as part of the spirit world that is within this earth before the resurrection, that is merely a type for or in the likeness of the celestialized earth that has this same spirit world as its inner earth, even though it is then in the post-resurrection where you no longer get a separation of the inward from the outward world that exists. And so essentially the description of one describes the other. If we again compare Doctrine and Covenants section 130 verse 7, which I previously quoted about angels that reside in the presence of God on a globe like a sea of glass, this equally describes the disembodied spirits in paradise before their resurrection, or exalted saints in the celestialized earth after their resurrection. So all of these concepts are part of my fifth reason why one describes the other. Now let's go on to my sixth reason why Revelation 4:6 describes celestial paradise. If you go to Revelation 14:1, which the time frame of this is at the time of the second coming. And it says, quote, "And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 having his father's name written in their foreheads," close quote. So this is describing the place of their habitation at this time. And if you go to Revelation 15:2, which corresponds in time to the verse I just read you in Revelation 14:1, it says that this place of their residence is as a, quote, "sea of glass mingled with fire," close quote. Now, so essentially what I'm saying is we have this sea of glass like crystal that we see in Revelation 4:6. It comes up again in Revelation 15, but the context then is it is mingled with the fire of the second coming. And we all recognize the second coming and the fire that will be associated with the second coming. It will be a time of great burning. And so you essentially have in verse 14:1, or chapter 14, verse 1, talking about the Lamb standing on Mount Zion in heaven, the 144,000. They are rising up, standing on a fiery sea of glass, because they are exaltation worthy saints. And so no one is said to stand on a fiery sea of glass in Revelation 4:6. And so they're distinguished, but yet it is the same place in different contexts and in different conditions. And so essentially what you have is this almost 2,000 years difference between John's vision of paradise as a sea of glass in Revelation 4:6, and after 2,000 years, as the second coming is upon us, now it is a sea of glass mingled with fire. And that we find in Revelation 15:2. And so you just kind of have to appreciate that the celestial spirit world is a dynamic place, and the element of fire is added to it because the image now is at the time of the second coming, and you have these redeemed saints who are on Mount Zion in their glorified and resurrected condition, and they dwell with God in everlasting burning. So, but even that time frame that we're looking at in Revelation 15:2 is still more than 1,000 years away before the earth dies and is resurrected, because the second coming, of course, is pre-millennium. Post-millennium is when we get the earth's death and its resurrection and its celestialization. So you got to keep all of these time frames in mind here and don't discombobulate them. Okay, so seventh reason why Revelation 4:6 describes the celestial paradise. And as I mentioned, these conditions all mirror one another. But the state of rest in paradise is represented by this calm, crystal-like sea of glass. And this is in contrast to the sea that is the troubled and tumultuous sea of mortality, right? And so if we take a look at the nature of the seas involved, this calm, crystal-like, paradisical sea of glass versus the tumultuous seas, then you can take a look at Revelation chapter 17, which is a description of the great horror of false religion as John describes it. And he's in Revelation 17:1, he's told, "Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters." Now, Nephi's apocalyptic vision also had this same image and same vision that John is saying. But you'll remember that in 1 Nephi 14, Nephi was told that he could not write the conditions and the visions that John would be seeing, and John was the one who was told that he had to write them. But Nephi was able to see these conditions, and this is what he says in verses 11 through 12 of chapter 14 in 1 Nephi, quote, "I looked and beheld the whore of all the earth, and she sat upon many waters, and she had dominion over all the earth, among all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people. And it came to pass that I beheld the church of the Lamb of God, and its numbers were few because of the wickedness and abomination of the whore who sat upon many waters." Close quote. And so what we see here that we're talking about here is the difference between the great whore of false religion here in the latter days, who has her dominion over all the earth, kindreds, tongues, and people, and she's supported by these many waters representing many people who are wicked. And so that's what the representation of these many waters are, and they're troublesome and they're turbulent seas. Whereas going into the paradise, we have the calm, crystal-like sea of glass, in counter-distinction to what the worldly conditions exist as. And so once again, we see how John uses the imagery of this sea of glass like unto crystal to represent the rest that people receive as they enter into the postmortal spirit world. And this is confirmed in other verses in the Book of Mormon that talk about the paradise being this place of rest and this time when the judgments of God are passed and you've been found worthy and justified to enter the postmortal spirit world. And to keep in mind also that the Sea of Glass is a great Urim and Thummim, as confirmed in the verses that I've already read to you. And the Urim and Thummim is something that allows us to see all things pertaining to inferior kingdoms that will be manifest. And this is talked about in Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, verse 9, saying, quote, "This earth in its sanctified and immortal state will be made like unto crystal, and will be a Urim and Thummim to the inhabitants who dwell thereon, whereby all things pertaining to an inferior kingdom, or all kingdoms of a lower order, will be made manifest to those who dwell on it." So if you compare that with the personal Urim and Thummim that people receive as described in Revelation 2:17, with the individual Urim and Thummim, you can see kingdoms of a higher order, and through the Urim and Thummim that is the celestialized earth, you will be able to see kingdoms of lower order. So check out my podcast for Revelation 2:17 on March 2nd of 2024, and you'll be able to read more about that individualized stone, that white stone that people receive that is also a Urim and Thummim. So essentially I'm talking here about how these conditions mirror, and we can learn from one versus the other. And Elder Ezra Taft Benson said this, quote, "When the spirits leave their bodies, they are in the presence of our Father and God. They are prepared then to see, hear, and understand spiritual things." And he's there quoting Brigham Young. So this again is another one of those statements that confirms how the conditions in the celestial paradise mirror conditions in the celestial kingdom. And what it's essentially saying is that if you qualify to go into celestial paradise, you will no longer have the veil of forgetfulness over your mind. If you make it there, all your trial, your testing, your probationary conditions will no longer exist. This is what Joseph Smith described about these conditions, saying, quote, "The spirits of the just are exalted to a greater and more glorious work. Hence they are blessed in their departure to the world of spirits. Enveloped in flaming fire, they are not far from us, and know and understand our thoughts, feelings, and motions, and are often pained therewith." Close quote. Now keep in mind that this statement is limited to the spirits of the just who exist in heaven. This does not apply to the spirit prison that also exists in the postmortal spirit world. Joseph F. Smith had this to say, quote, "The righteous spirit that departs from this earth is assigned its place in the paradise of God. It has its privileges and honors, which are in point of excellency far above and beyond human comprehension. And in this sphere of action, enjoying this partial reward for its righteous conduct on the earth, it is born again into the presence of God." Close quote. Keep in mind, it's not the fullness of the presence of God, but is born again into the presence of God. And so we're going to have this confirmed for us as we talk about our podcast next time, where we're going to be talking about these four beasts who are in paradise, full of eyes before and behind, and the imagery of what that represents. But it's clear that in the postmortal spirit world, in paradise, the veil of forgetfulness is removed, and you have the ability to look back at what's going back here on earth. You're going to see your peeps, and you're going to feel compassion for them, and all of the things that accompany that, and being pained with some of the things that they're still having to go through, and hoping, that you can endure to the end. And so stay tuned for next week, and we'll talk some more about the four beasts who are also in celestial paradise and their meaning. I thank you all for listening, watching, subscribing, and sharing. And thanks to Jennifer, all her help in making sure the technical things happen to make this podcast possible. And I'll see you next time.